Hello, Lakeview family. Hope you are all well. It is today, as I film this, and when this will be posted, it is Ash Wednesday. And we talked about this a little bit on Sunday, the beginning of the season of Lent, which is the 40 days leading up to Easter, not counting Sundays if you are one of those math people who's going to try to figure that out. So it's a 40-day period celebrated in the church as a way of preparing ourselves for what is to come and the crucifixion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. This time and season, often called a season of preparation. In part, it was back in the day, in the early part of the church, it was a time of preparation for baptismal candidates. And so there's a variety of ways in which this is used and incorporated into the life of the church. And for a lot of folks, if you're familiar with it, you may kind of be familiar with Ash Wednesday as a time when people, and the season of Lent, when people will give something up, fast something, or just give something up for those 40 days as a means of kind of dying to self, this kind of practice of recognizing those things that can have a hold on us in order to make space for time with the Lord, in order to make space for recognizing and focusing on this season as a season of growth and anticipation, and also recognizing the need for times in our lives when we focus on the reality of and presence of sin in our lives. Ash Wednesday particularly, and the season of Lent, is very much focused on the act of confession, something that we have lost in the Protestant, particularly evangelical church. The idea of the need for confession of sins, both confession to the Lord, but also public confession, and the power that comes from that in removing the power and control that sin has in our lives, which is very much tied to the work of sanctification that the Spirit does within us to break that power of sin that has been paid for, that has been canceled. So here we go, beginning the season of Lent. And in the season of Lent, on Sundays, we're going to be looking at a sequence of spiritual disciplines, those things that we participate in that help us abide in Jesus. And I want us to think about the disciplines in that way. So we've done this whole series on Abide. We've talked about it numerous years. We're launching into, on Sunday, we'll start Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And we have quite a few people that are engaged in that, and I'm excited about that and the ways in which in the next coming years we will use emotionally healthy discipleship as a means of helping us understand what it means to be disciples of Jesus. In particular, one of the key components is slowing down and making space for our relationship with God to grow and to thrive, and spending time cultivating that relationship with Jesus. And tied into that is an idea of spiritual disciplines, which a lot of us participate in. Scripture reading, prayer, fasting, all of these things that are spiritual disciplines have been a part of the rhythms of the church for centuries in helping people grow and becoming more like Jesus. So when we talk about spiritual disciplines, that is what we're talking about. Those things that we participate in, that God invites us to participate in, where we can learn and grow and become more like Jesus. The emphasis, the focus always for these things is they are a means of grace. They're an avenue for helping us in our call to be like Jesus. So it's about a 6-week stretch that we'll be doing this, and the spiritual disciplines that we will focus on in this time period are fasting, service, giving, prayer, silence and solitude will be a Sunday focus, and then Sabbath. We will look at these things in some form or fashion to understand them better, to give us tools for thinking about them, and practical ways to begin to practice these disciplines, to engage in them in our lives. And hopefully you understand that I want to do this. I want to invite us on this journey in a way that isn't focused on doing, that isn't an expectation. I will say it over and over again. Throughout this series, you will get tired of me saying it. But this is an invitation to disciplines. This is not an expectation. This isn't your pastor building on a list of things that you have to do or that you are required to do to be a Christian. There's no obligation. Now, I will say that a part of the formation process is that as we become more like Jesus, what happens is this continued welling desire to be more like Jesus, to participate in those things that look like Jesus, the things that Jesus participated in, the disciplines that were a part of his life and his teachings that are directly tied to being more like Jesus. And so we'll look at those from this avenue. The first one we'll look at this Sunday is fasting. This idea of fasting, biblically, very strong connection to fasting of food. I mentioned Ash Wednesday and the season of Lent. Fasting is a part of that, also giving things up, abstention, abstaining from things. Nazarenes are very familiar with abstaining. There are things that we abstain from, particularly alcohol, tobacco, things that as a holiness denomination have been woven into a part of our story for good reason and particular reasons that I think in a lot of ways are taken out of context or misunderstood or never even understood at all. And any spiritual discipline, anything of abstention or whatever, when it's void of a deep why that is particularly laced with grace and a pursuit of holiness and being like Jesus, when it's void of that, it looks like what Jesus rebuked in the Pharisees, and it becomes legalism. And so in this whole process, I'm talking about spiritual disciplines. It's invitation. I'm pushing back against legalism and legalistic tendencies. And these things are designed to bring freedom in relationship with Christ, help us to become more like Jesus. And also, it's going to push back hard against the things that exist in our life, because we oftentimes will talk about how busy we are. And I will say, too, I'm going to push back against this. The more I hear from all of us, myself included, the pushback of, I'm just so busy, I don't have space, I'm going to say things like, that is exactly why we need these disciplines. That our lives are full of things that are not drawing us deeper into relationship with Jesus. And we will say a lot of things that kind of resemble excuses for why we can't engage. And it, in most cases, will be true that in this season or whatever you're facing, you don't have space. But the deeper question isn't, well, you need to just make it. The deeper question is why? Why don't you have space? So for some of you, even before, and this was true for me, before really engaging in acts of discipline, spiritual disciplines, to help me be formed and shaped into the image of Christ for the sake of others, before doing that, I had to stop and sit with, why is my life so busy? Why do I have no margin? Why can I not pause and spend time with the Lord? What is going on? What am I pursuing? Why am I driven to that? Why? What is going on? And there's some things that have to probably be removed, or things that we have to assess and look at and die to in order to make space for these disciplines to be a part of our life and rhythm. So we're going to look at the discipline of fasting, look at it from a biblical perspective, particularly tied to food. We don't really see other things of abstaining or fasting in Scripture, but there's a lot of individuals, and I think in our culture, I think it's very helpful and healthy to fast things other than food, because our souls are feeding on a lot of things, and so it's looking at what are some things that we can fast, what are some things that we can give up or abstain from in order to make more space for, or to shift our reliance onto God as opposed to things, to really understand this idea of daily bread. And I love that God in Jesus uses this idea of daily bread throughout Scripture, and then we see Jesus as bread, as a living bread, as water, as living water. And I think it's no mistake, right, that Jesus talks about daily bread. Scripture is much about this idea of bread and the sustenance that comes from God, and then also this connection with fasting, that we give up physical food because of the spiritual nourishment that comes from the living bread. So we'll look at all these things on Sunday. I have a fun little a little acronym that I use for FAST, which is fail people's and your expectations, accept ownership and responsibility of your life and journey, see people for who they are and set them free from what oppresses them, and the T is taste and see that the Lord is good. So just a fun way for me in my journey that I've used this little acronym to remember fasting and a way for me to think about what it is. And so we'll walk through that. And I look forward to being with you on Sunday and beginning the series through Lent, looking at a variety of spiritual disciplines and doing it in concert with the launch of Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, which is baked in with a lot of focus on spiritual disciplines of scripture, of silence and solitude, and Sabbath and rest. These things that help us have a rhythm to develop and to grow and pour into our relationship with Jesus. So have a great rest of your week. I will see you all on Sunday. Blessings.